Hey, my name is Bill Ferriter, and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about how singletons can create more collaborative opportunities, more meaningful collaborative opportunities for themselves. Now, the content that I'm going to share with you is a part of a much larger breakout that I do at PLC Institutes for Solution Tree. I want you to know that the link to that full breakout is on your screen right now. You can also see the link to the session handouts as well. I'll put those in the session description for this video when we're done. So if you want to go and look at the full breakout presentation, you can. We're not going to do the full breakout. That would be 90 minutes long. It involves all kinds of side partner conversations. So I'm going to just do an overview of how my team tackled the Singleton challenge. But again, if you're interested in digging deeper into what more options might look like, these full resources may be of value to you. Again, the name's Bill Ferriter. I taught for 29 years as a classroom teacher in the Wake County area. That's Raleigh-Durham in North Carolina. And I'm probably here because I've written a bunch of books for Solution Tree. My main area of expertise is both coaching collaborative teams and helping to set up systems of intervention. In almost all of my books, there are recommendations for how teams can tackle the Singleton challenge. Title I'm the proudest of, though, is again, I taught for 29 years. And in that 29-year teaching career, I became a singleton for a really interesting reason. I taught in a very large middle school. And at the time, I was teaching either 6th grade science or 8th grade science. And we should have been able to study our standards together because there were multiple 6th grade and 8th grade science teachers working on the same hallway. Here's the hitch, though. Because of growth, our schools converted to what's called a multi-track year-round calendar. Now, that might sound awful to you to begin with, but at least as far as my personal well-being goes, it was the most amazing teaching opportunity I ever had. However, it made collaboration really difficult because in a multi-track year-round calendar, even if you have multiple teachers that are teaching the same grade level and subject area, they're never in the same place in their curriculum at the same time. So studying their standards is difficult. Sometimes a teacher might be 3 weeks behind their peers. So why would we talk about standards when some colleagues are further ahead in the curriculum and some colleagues are further behind in the curriculum? Or how do we make conversations around assessments meaningful when you gave the assessment 3 weeks ago, or I'm not going to give the assessment for the next 3 weeks? So for our team, we had to find more meaningful collaborative solutions because studying standards just didn't feel worthwhile. I want you to know that that's what I think makes me the right presenter for you right now. Like, I'm not sharing suggestions that I just sort of dreamed up sitting in a home office. I'm going to share a solution that I actually used with my Singleton collaborative team for a long time. We polished it and perfected it over time to the point where I think it worked really well. And I want you to learn from me and see whether or not my solution may make sense for you too. Now, by no means am I the only expert at Solution Tree on Singleton challenges. There's actually 3 books out there that you may want to dig into if you really want to learn more. Aaron Hansen wrote the first book about singletons for Solution Tree. It's a nice short read, and inside there are 3 specific solutions that are described in detail that you might find interesting. Breeze Longwell Daniels wrote the second book about singletons, and it is specifically about how collaboration worked in her small rural community. And so if you're in a small school, if you're a singleton because you work in a very small place, Breeze's book might be a good read for you. The newest book is from Brigleen and John Yost, and what they've done is they've taken all of the collective knowledge that we've built about the Singleton Challenge over the years, and they've summarized it into one new text. All 3 books are great reads and will give you ideas about additional starting points if you want to dig deeper into what collaboration can look like for singleton teachers. Now, I want to start here. My friend and mentor, Becky DeFore, used to say that clarity precedes competence. So before we can understand exactly what a singleton team can do, let's understand what collaboration is supposed to be or involve. And I like this definition. It comes from Rick, Becky, and Bob, Rick DeFore, Becky DeFore, Bob Aker. And it comes from a document called A Big Picture Look at Professional Learning Communities. And what they said was, If you're doing the right work of a collaborative team, you're relentlessly questioning the status quo. And I think that's a really interesting definition. I want you to notice first that it doesn't say that you're relentlessly questioning your curriculum. Now, don't get me wrong, that's the best option. The gold standard for collaborative teams is teachers who are teaching the same grade level in the same subject area with each other. But that's not in the definition of what a collaborative team would do. What a collaborative team is supposed to do is relentlessly question the status quo. Notice that status quo is a lot broader than just study your curriculum. They go on to say that if you're relentlessly questioning the status quo, you should be seeking new methods of teaching and learning, then testing those methods, and then assessing the impact of your professional choices on your kids. Right? So if you're doing the right work of a collaborative team, you're seeking new methods of teaching and learning, you're testing the methods, and then you're reflecting on results. Now, as we look at the core work of a professional learning community, one of the things that was helpful to my team was understanding that we should be answering the 4 critical questions of learning in what we call cycles of inquiry. So we always start by saying, what is it we want our students to know? And then how are we going to teach that concept to our kids? How will we assess their progress towards mastery? And then how are we going to respond when students struggle and then when students are working beyond our expectations? That's the rhythm of the work that collaborative teams conduct. Identify something important for kids to know, talk about how we teach it, and then assess their learning, not just so that we can provide interventions, but so that we can evaluate our instructional practices, and then develop a plan for when kids struggle and when kids work beyond our expectations. That is the work of a collaborative team. That's how we seek new methods and test those methods and refine our practices together. Now, the question that I have for you is, why is that harder for Singleton teachers? Go ahead and pause your video and have that conversation with your side partners. If our job is to answer the 4 critical questions of learning, which technically isn't all that difficult, identify an essential, make an assessment plan, an intervention plan, and extension. If the technical work of collaboration isn't all that difficult, then why is this so hard for Singleton teachers? Okay, pause your video, and when you're ready, hit play, and we'll start again. Okay, so I'm relatively certain that you found lots of reasons why this work is harder for Singleton teachers. Odds are the first thing you said is, well, we don't share standards together, so what do we study? When we're picking essentials, aren't those essentials supposed to come from our standards? I mean, that's what the state wants our kids to learn. That's what the community said was important. That's what's covered on the standardized test. And so how do you pick essentials if the people that are on your team don't share the same curriculum as you? It's a really common challenge that Singleton teams have. There's other challenges, though. Sometimes our master schedule is a challenge, right? You might not even share a planning period with other people. You might even be responsible for absorbing or covering kids while they're receiving instruction or intervention from other teachers. I've been in buildings where Singleton teachers didn't even have a collaborative planning period with each other. There was no time to meet with other teachers because the other teachers were always busy with kids when they were free during their planning period. And all of those structures can get in the way and cause challenges for Singleton teachers who are trying to collaborate with one another. Now, I might blow your mind here because I actually think the biggest challenge to meaningful collaboration for Singleton teachers are the very definitions we use for collaborative practices. For example, if you think that collaboration around instruction has to be collaboration around your essential standards, automatically you eliminate all Singleton teachers from having a meaningful collaborative experience because they don't share their curriculum with other people. And so when we use definitions, sometimes the definitions that we hold in our head, our understandings of the PLC at work process, become the barrier that prevent us from finding meaningful collaborative opportunities with others. I'll give you an example. It is completely common for teams and teachers to shorten the 4 critical questions. When I ask people to tell me what the 4 critical questions are, usually what they'll say for critical question number 1 is, what do we want our students to learn? And it's that word, what do we want our students to learn, that's the problem. Because when we say, what do we want our students to learn, teachers' minds immediately go, well, all the junk that's in our curriculum. Do you know what the first critical question of learning actually says? Take a look at the full version of the first critical question of learning. It says, what knowledge, skills, and dispositions should students acquire as a result of this unit of instruction? Notice that it doesn't just say, what do we want our students to learn? Instead, it says, what knowledge, skills, and dispositions do we want kids to master? I would argue that it's the skills and dispositions part that provide collaborative opportunities for Singleton teachers. So the first thing I want you to think about is, has your school shortened the 4 critical questions? When you ask people what the first critical question of learning is, do people say, what do we want our students to learn? Because if they do, that act of shortening the first critical question down to the word learn only may be the barrier preventing your school from finding new collaborative opportunities for Singleton teachers. To us, the idea of learn means the things in our curriculum. But if that's all we think about as what we should be collaborating around, we limit anything that a Singleton teacher can do because they don't share curriculum with other people all that often. Instead, I like the phrase, what do we want our students to know and be able to do? No, that's the knowledge part in the first critical question of learning. Be able to do, that's the skills and dispositions part in the first critical question of learning. And to be honest, there's tons of skills and dispositions that we care about. There's tons of things that we want students to know and be able to do by the time they leave our classroom. And that be able to do part could well be the best collaborative opportunity for Singleton teachers. Why don't we study the skills and dispositions that we care about? Do you need an example? So as a teacher, especially as a science teacher, I really believe that kids need to be able to evaluate the information that they're looking at on the web. They need to know if a source that they're looking at is reliable or whether or not that source is biased. Now, studying bias in text or authors biased in text, that's something that happens in the language arts classroom. But I would argue that examining bias and being able to identify it should be an outcome that we study across classrooms. And it doesn't matter what unit you happen to be in while you're studying. It doesn't matter what topic you happen to be teaching to your kids. We can all study how do we teach kids to identify bias. That makes sense to you? I'll give you another example. I'm the parent of an 8th grade daughter. I love her with my entire soul. At the end of the last semester, she had 23 zeros. Parent of the year, right? What my 8th grade daughter needs to learn isn't necessarily the content that's in the curriculum. She's pretty good at mastering content. What she's not good at is the habits of a learner. Being able to meet deadlines, being able to organize her agenda, being able to find her work and get it turned in by a due date. Those are habits of learners, right? And we want students to master those things. But how are we teaching them to our students? Like, what is our deliberate instruction around the habits of a learner? More importantly, how are we assessing whether kids have mastered the habits of a learner? And what are you going to do when a student like mine doesn't master the habits of a learner? It's funny, isn't it? We complain about that kid who's got missing work galore, but have we taught students how to organize their agendas, and do we have systematic interventions when a student hasn't mastered the habits of a learner? If we don't, then we're not really relentlessly questioning the status quo, are we? We're not really sharing, refining, and assessing the impact of our practices around the skills and dispositions that we want kids to learn. I'll give you a final example. I hear us say all the time that we want students to become good at critical thinking. That's not uncommon. You probably have critical thinking outcomes in your standards somewhere. But have you ever taken the time to sit down and talk about, well, what does critical thinking mean? What does it look like in action? How do we teach kids to become better at critical thinking? See, because I would argue that most schools that I go to, I never see that work happening. We know critical thinking matters, but we don't systematically teach it, assess it, intervene around it, or extend. And what's wild is that would be an awesome collaborative opportunity for Singleton teachers, because I don't care what subject you happen to teach, critical thinking is an important component of being successful in every classroom. So instead of studying our curriculum, we could study the ways that we teach students to become better at critical thinking. Are you with me so far? It's the skills and dispositions portion of the first critical question of learning that opens up collaborative opportunities for Singleton teachers. Now, let me show you how easy this is. I want you to spend no more than 2 minutes. If you need to set a timer, do it. If you want to look at the clock on the wall, do it. I want you to brainstorm a list of 5 skills and dispositions in that amount of time. Things that students should be able to do if they're going to be successful in your classrooms. All right, go ahead and do that and be ready at the end of that 2 minutes to hit pause. And then at the end of that 2 minutes, be ready to hit play again. We'll move forward and I'll show you what this might look like in action. Okay, let's come together in 3 and in 2 and in 1. Now, I bet you that was a breeze for you. When I asked this question in my breakout sessions, I hear tons of powerful answers. People will say things like, I want kids to learn how to communicate with each other. Like when they're engaged in a group conversation, do they know how to build knowledge with one another? I hear people say that they want students to learn how to be respectful. Like just simple respect is something that's important to students that they haven't yet mastered. I hear people say things like they want students to be able to understand the bias that's on online sources all around them. I hear people talk about they want students to understand how to defend a claim with reasonable evidence. How do you collect evidence to support your argument? All of those things are skills that we talk about and yet we never study. Do you remember when there was a time in education where we spent all of our time focused on the 21st century skills of a learner? How often did your team study the strategies that you use to teach students those 21st century skills? Today, we talk an awful lot about how businesses want students that have mastered the soft skills. How often does your team spend time talking about, well, what are those soft skills? What do we mean by that? How do we instruct students, assess students, and intervene when kids struggle? The answer is you probably don't. And my argument is, what a neat opportunity for Singleton teachers. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, Singleton teachers that are out there, I want to be perfectly honest, I think you're the lucky people in your school. See, because I worked on a collaborative team for a long time before we became Singletons, and we were expected to study our curriculum and our curriculum only. Now, don't get me wrong, that's gold standard. It's the most efficient. It's what we're required to teach to our kids. Why not get good at it, right? However, after 13 years of studying the 6th grade science curriculum, it got pretty boring to study 6th grade science. I mean, year after year after year, it was like, okay, well, do you remember how we taught soil profiles? Are we going to revise the way that we teach soil profiles? My goodness, after 13 years, I sort of knew how to teach soil profiles. So it felt like overkill to continue to study it. What's neat is we know that skills and dispositions matter to kids. And if they do, and we know that we want our own students to master those things, the children in your life, I think you would probably say, you hope master those skills and dispositions. When you can't study your curriculum, you have to study skills and dispositions. And to me, I feel like that's a win. Now, how do you find skills and dispositions that truly matter? Well, if you're looking at my session handouts, remember they're linked in the video description down at the bottom. I want you to flip to page 2, because what you'll see is a tool that I added to the Big Book of Tools, my recent PLC book, that details 6 different major categories of skills that outside experts say are important to students. The 2 that I think matter the most, top right-hand corner, That's David Conley. He's a university researcher at Stanford. And he actually says that those 6 or 7 things in the top right-hand box are the only things that a student would need to know and be able to do to be ready for college. So if college readiness is something that matters inside of your district, those skills might be good starting points for Singleton collaborative teams. How do we teach those skills to our kids? How do we assess those skills? How do we know that our instructional practices are working? What do we do to intervene when kids struggle with those skills? And how will we extend when kids are working beyond our expectations? You can conduct a cycle of inquiry about one of those skills, no matter which content you teach with the other people on your collaborative teams. Career readiness is the bottom right-hand corner. Oftentimes when I work in middle and in high schools, there are CTE teachers, career and technical ed teachers. Well, guess what? The career and technical education associations, the large groups that oversee career and technical education, have defined a series of career readiness skills. They're in the bottom right-hand corner. So instead of studying keyboarding or instead of studying computer programming, why don't you study the career readiness skills together? How do you teach them? How do you assess them? How do you intervene around them? How do you extend? That is meaningful collaborative work. That is relentlessly questioning the status quo on behalf of the students in your classroom. You can share, refine, and assess the impact of your instructional practices when it comes to skills just as easily as you could study the impact of your instructional practices around the essential standards in your curriculum. Now, let me show you specifically how my team did this work. I'm going to show you 2 examples. One is an early example of our collaborative work. Second is a later example of our collective work. Now, remember, if we did this right, our team should be relentlessly questioning our practice. We should be collecting evidence of the impact that our instructional choices are having on kids. And we should be studying essential skills, content, and behavior that pass the endurance, leverage, and readiness test. Those words are important to understand. A skill that has endurance is something that's going to matter to kids long after they've left school. A skill that has leverage is a skill that a student can learn in science class and also apply in math, or a skill that a student can learn in band class and also apply in art. And a skill that has readiness is a skill that students need to learn this year in order to be ready for the exact same class next year. So my team understood that endurance, leverage, readiness, that's how we pick important outcomes. So we actually used another tool. It's on page 4 in your packet. If you want to open that up. Again, handouts are linked in the session description. We used a tool to sort of guide our thinking around that. We made a 3-column chart up on our board. We actually did this with the whiteboard in the classroom. And we brainstormed some readiness things, some leverage things, and some endurance things that we wanted our students to learn. Now, we decided that the readiness questions we were going to teach on our own. If you read those are mostly connected to our science curriculum. That didn't work for my collaborative team because we were never in the same place at the same time. But having that list was valuable because now at least we had a shared understanding of what was important in our curriculum. We taught those things individually. We might sometimes have conversations about how we taught those things, but it's not where we invested the majority of our collaborative efforts. We knew right away that we were going to focus the majority of our collaborative efforts on the things that you see in the leverage or endurance column, because those are things that we could teach regardless of what unit we were in our curriculum. We finally settled on the outcome that you see bolded in your text or on your screen. We decided to study how do we better teach nonfiction to our students, right? We were science teachers. Nonfiction content is around us all the time. So we thought, how do you teach a kid to interact with nonfiction content? That was our outcome. That was what we were going to study together. And so we spent the entire year brainstorming strategies for teaching nonfiction to kids. We actually found 4, and we would implement 1 strategy per quarter. And when I say implement, what I mean by that is we had lesson plans for teaching that nonfiction reading strategy to kids. We brainstormed what it would look like in action. In our collaborative meetings, we said, how are you teaching that nonfiction reading strategy to kids? How am I teaching that nonfiction reading strategy to kids? Now, that's all fine and dandy, and it was more meaningful than anything we were doing before that point, right? At least we were studying our instruction around something that we knew mattered to kids. But here's the hitch. In a professional learning community, what makes collaborative teams different is we collect evidence of the impact of our instruction. You have to assess. And we don't just assess to figure out which kids got it and which kids didn't. We also assess so that we can gather evidence of the efficacy of our practices. We're trying to get better at teaching important things to kids. One of my favorite quotes about meaningful collaborative work is we want to have more good teaching happening from more teachers more of the time. So assessment is essential because it gives you evidence about whether your strategies are working or not, but assessment can be tricky when you're talking about skills. How do you assess whether your nonfiction reading strategies are having a positive impact on kids? It was a whole lot easier as a science teacher to assess science content. I'm going to do that with some multiple choice questions, maybe an open-ended question. But how in the world do you assess nonfiction? My team had to figure out a strategy. And here's what we came up with. We actually started to survey our students. And we started to say, what did you think of the strategy that we just taught? What did you think of the way that we taught the strategy? And we gathered information and we put it into what we call a one-pager. Again, you can see this on page 7 inside of the session materials. So this was our common assessment. We had students fill out a Google form. They told us which teacher they were in a classroom with. We asked them to tell us, what did you like about the way that teachers taught that nonfiction reading strategy? What were the strengths of that practice and what got in the way? And I've got to tell you, we learned tons about our own instruction. Probably the biggest thing that we found out is on this particular nonfiction reading strategy, we were teaching students to make what we called active thinking comments. We said that good readers of nonfiction are thinking while they're reading. It's not just read and be done. And when good thinkers are thinking, they should be recording some of their thoughts. Because if you're recording your thoughts, you're more engaged in the text that you're reading. When you're recording your thoughts, you have some follow-up that you can have a conversation for. This all makes sense, doesn't it? It's a good practice. So we would ask our students, while you're reading nonfiction, we want you to record at least 5 active thinking comments. And what we learned from our students in our surveys is they hated making the active reading comments because they felt like it was interrupting their reading. So as they were reading, they were really not paying attention to the text. They were just really paying attention to where can I make an active thinking comment because I got to make 5 of them and I know my teacher's going to grade these things. What did that mean to us? Well, it told us that our instructional practice wasn't as effective as it could be. So we changed the way that we taught our students. We would ask our students to do a pre-read of the text with no active thinking comments at all. And that happened about a week before we'd come back to the text. So it was a warm-up activity, just kind of give this a read-through. And then when we came back to the text, we would ask our students to make active reading comments the second time around. See, that's what collaborative teams do. They're trying to improve their instructional practices based on evidence that they gather, based on evidence that the impact that those practices had on kids. Now, I want you to rate our team's efforts. Remember, this was the first attempt that we made at studying studying a skill and a disposition together. And if we did it right, we should have been relentlessly questioning our practice together, sharing, refining, and assessing the impact of strategies. We should have been collecting evidence about the impact that our practices had on kids. And we should have been studying things that pass the endurance leverage readiness test. If that's the criteria, how would you rate our early work? 1 means that's trash. Why is Bill even sharing it with us? 5 means it couldn't be any better. That is perfect. Okay, hit pause, have that conversation with your side partners. How would you rate our early collaborative work? All right, so here's my answer to the question. Our early collaborative work was probably a 2 or a 3. The example I just shared with you is probably a 2 or a 3. We were definitely relentlessly questioning our practice together. We were definitely gathering some evidence about the impact that our practices were having on students. We were definitely studying something that passed the endurance leverage readiness test. That's all fantastic. Here's the hitch, though. When we gather evidence about the impact that our instructional choices are having on kids, we also need to be able to plan interventions and extensions for specific students. And our common assessment, that survey, it didn't give us any information over which kids had mastered the skill we thought was important and which kids didn't. We had no information at the student level that could help us to intervene or extend on behalf of kids. So was it perfect? No. Was it better than what we were doing? Yep. Would I take that as a first step from everybody? Absolutely. But my team didn't stop there. We realized that if we were going to study skills and dispositions, we had to find a way that we could gather assessment data at the student level about those skills and dispositions. And that's when we stumbled upon a tool called a performance tracking template. It comes from a suggestion that Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey made in an Ed Leadership magazine a long time ago. If you want to see the actual handout again, you can find it inside of the materials for this session, which are linked in the session description. Fundamentally, this is what a performance tracker looks like. What my team did next is we moved from studying nonfiction reading strategies to, on our team, studying the skills and dispositions necessary to communicate information gathered in a lab, right? We're all science teachers. We're teaching different content, so we can't study content together because we're not teaching it at the same time. But we were all doing labs in our class. And as a science teacher, being able to communicate the information that you gather in a lab is an important skill. So we sat down together and we said, well, we want to improve our students' ability to communicate findings from a lab. And we brainstormed 4 mistakes that they typically make. That's in the far right-hand column. Those are the errors that students make. That was the first step in our conversation because it helped us to focus our work. Well, we better talk about how are we teaching students to do those things. If we see that they write hypotheses that have more than one tested variable, then how do we teach kids to write better hypotheses? The last outcome, if we see that students never refer to data from the lab in their conclusions, then how are we teaching kids to make the connection between those two things? So those are errors we brainstormed together, and it led our decisions about what sorts of instructional practices were we going to brainstorm with each other. Then we printed this table out, we put it on a clipboard, and we kept it in our classrooms whenever we were teaching a lab. And what we would do is, as we saw and observed students working in a lab, whether it was something we watched with our eyes, whether it was a conversation we had with a student, whether it was student work samples that we were looking at, whenever we saw a student making one of our 4 common mistakes, we put their initials in the boxes on our performance tracking table. So what you're seeing is the initials of kids that are struggling. And I would argue that this is a pretty strong example of a common assessment for a team, because immediately teams can use this to identify what skills do we teach well, what skills are we struggling to teach. Has any individual teacher spotted or identified strategies that work better than the other strategies that we've been using? We have a point of comparison between one another. And last but not least, we can identify specific students who need intervention or extension. And let me see if you can spot those things. Like this is my performance tracker for this unit. If I brought this to our collaborative table, could you tell me right now the skills that I teach really well? Could you tell me the skills that I'm struggling to teach? Are there any individual class periods that respond to my instruction better than others? And are there any specific class periods that respond to my instruction worse than others? Hit pause and see if you can make those discoveries. So there's definitely evidence here. I want you to notice that however I'm teaching procedures is really working. That's a strategy that I need to share with my peers. If I have colleagues that come back to the collaborative table and they have lots of initials in that row, they can learn from me. I can share a strategy with them because something about the way I teach procedures is awesome. However, I need help when it comes to getting kids to include evidence from the lab in their conclusions. The strategy I tried didn't work. How do I know that? There's a billion initials in that box down there. So when we come back to the collaborative table, I'm going to be turning to peers and saying, did anybody have a better strategy that I can go back and try because mine didn't work? If my whole team has lots of initials in that box, then we all have to try a new strategy. It's time to turn to the Google or go find a peer to learn from or pull up a scientific journal and learn how people teach this to kids because we know that our strategy is not working all that well. I also found out as an individual teacher that I struggle with my third period class. That's evidence I need to think about. My instructional practice worked with my first, second, and fourth period classes, in hypotheses particularly, but it didn't work with period 3. I have to ask myself, what is that? What caused that difference between the instructional practice being received well by some periods, but not by period 3? And similarly, the instructional practices that I'm using, they work the best for my period 1 kids. That gives me information as a teacher that I can use to refine my instruction, to relentlessly question the status quo, to find new opportunities for me to improve my instruction. But again, remember that the key here is I didn't just get evidence of my instruction, I also got individual students in need of intervention and extension. That's what makes this a more meaningful, common formative assessment for a team that's studying a skill and a disposition. There's 2 purposes for assessing learning. The first is to identify kids in need of intervention and extension. I've got that. That's what the initials are. The second is to get information that we can use to improve our instruction. I've got that too. I can spot patterns in the number of initials for each of the missing or each of the common errors we expect students to make. Is this all starting to make sense to you? Now, I want you to rate our second attempt, right? We studied the skills necessary to communicate information from the lab. Rate that on a scale of 1 to 5. Remember, we needed to be relentlessly questioning our practice. We needed to collect evidence of our instruction and which students got it and which students didn't. And we had to study something that passed the endurance leverage readiness test. How do we do this time? Scale of 1 to 5. Hit pause, and when you're ready, hit play again. Okay, honestly, I'm going to pat myself on my back now. I mean, maybe I'm bragging, but I thought that was awesome. I can tell you this, my team really felt like our collaborative work was meaningful. And it was one of the first times that we felt that our collaborative work was meaningful in a long time. As teachers who couldn't study curriculum together, we were trying to study curriculum because we thought that's the only option we had. It didn't work all that well. I wasn't in the same place as my peers. They weren't in the same place as me. They didn't want to talk about what I was teaching because they had moved on. I didn't want to talk about what they were teaching because they were weeks ahead. We never really looked at our common assessments. We wrote some, but we never really looked at them together because my peers didn't want to go back and look at an assessment they had done 3 weeks ago. I didn't want to look at their results in advance because I mean, it didn't matter to me at that time. So when we started to study skills and dispositions, and when we stumbled on that performance tracker as a tool for assessing skills and dispositions, that felt like a home run to us. It was one of the very first times that we sat together and we said, holy smokes, collaborating as Singleton teachers can be meaningful and interesting. Now, principals in the room, I know what you're thinking. In your mind, you're like, yeah, but wait a minute. I need them to study their standards. They have to get better at teaching what they were hired to teach. And I agree. In a perfect world, that's exactly what you would do. And if you want your teachers to collaborate electronically, if you want them to find a virtual partner in a completely different school to collaborate with, it's possible. I mean, with digital tools, we can all collaborate with a partner who teaches the same grade level and content as we do. But principals, that comes with extra challenges. You might not have teachers who really are all that interested in virtual collaboration. I mean, anyone else sick of Zoom at this point? After all of the COVID pandemic, I don't know that I want to collaborate virtually. I want to collaborate with someone in my building, like a colleague I know. Principals, if you decide you want to pursue virtual collaboration, then you've got to do coordination with other principals to make sure that your teachers have time on the clock to collaborate with their peers at other schools. I see lots of principals who will say, well, I'm going to give you a virtual partner, but I can't give you a shared planning period with that virtual partner. It doesn't work, principals. Like, your deal in this whole thing is to facilitate collaborative opportunities for teachers. And so if you want your teachers to collaborate virtually, how are you going to line up planning periods with schools and other places? Are you going to call up that principal and work on your master schedule together? You better, because otherwise it's unfair to ask teachers who are singletons to collaborate virtually with a partner that they don't share a common time with during the course of their workday. Now you're expecting them to collaborate outside the workday. That's not fair. You can't ask that of teachers. So to me, skills and dispositions always made the most sense because we can do it with the current team we have. We don't need to change schedules. We don't have to find new partners. We just have to be willing to think about the fact that skills and dispositions matter to kids too. It's not just the knowledge in our curriculum. Does that make sense to you? And teachers out there, your job is just to identify skills and dispositions that are applicable regardless of who the member of your teams are. Does that make sense too? Like, we have to pick a skill or a disposition that matters to all of our students regardless of our subject area. And what's neat is when teachers get into the rhythm of studying their practice around skills and dispositions with each other, my argument is they will get into that same rhythm when studying their standards by themselves. You're increasing the reflective capacity of teachers by giving them the opportunity to have an important reflective moment with their peers. And when they learn that process around skills and dispositions, my argument is they will apply that process around their own standards, even if they're working by themselves. The last example I have with you is, so my team started by studying nonfiction reading strategies. We moved on to study how do you communicate evidence from a lab. Our next step is we studied how do you support a claim with evidence. Not only is that an important language arts skill, so it's got leverage, it crosses domains. It's also an incredibly important skill in science class. I would argue this is a skill that applies in places like music or art or drama, right? If you're going to make a claim about a music piece, how are you going to support with evidence your argument, right? So I think this is a skill that has broad application, lots of leverage, and it definitely applies in life, so it has endurance. I wish politicians would support their arguments with evidence. So what we said to ourselves is, how do we teach kids to make a good claim? How do we teach kids what evidence is worthwhile and what evidence is not worthwhile? Where are our lessons around that? What rubric will we use to score students when we're looking at the claims they make and the evidence they use? Can we develop exemplars of what high quality work looks like so that we can communicate it to everyone? That's what we spent our collaborative time on. We didn't spend our collaborative time on our standards, again, because we didn't share them at the same time. They weren't in common. What was in common was this skill that we could study with one another. I'll give you one final tip to take away. When my team studied a skill, we generally spent an entire year on it. It just felt right. My argument would be, you study a skill until you have evidence that your strategies are helping all students to learn that skill. So if you pick a skill and you can find proof that the strategies you're using are helping all students to master the skill, that's when you know it's time to move on to study a new skill. If you can do it in less than a year, go for it. For my team, it just made sense to study one skill per year. It gave us some kind of structure to what we were going to do in our collaborative meetings over the course of the year. All right, final chance to pause. Okay, you're going to hit pause on the player. What I want you to do is talk with your side partners. How do you feel about my argument that studying skills and dispositions is a collaborative starting point for Singleton teams? Does this resonate with you? Is it something you think you can do? Go ahead and have that conversation. So you've already heard me say it. For my team, that was the right solution. We got way into studying skills with each other. We loved it. It was an easy rhythm. It was motivating because we knew it mattered. No one else in our building was doing it. But it's not the only option that collaborative teams of Singleton teachers have. In fact, if you look on the screen, there are the 4 popular options for collaborative teams. Number 1, grade-based and course-based teams. Probably not happening for Singleton teachers, at least in your building. Options 2, 3, and 4 are options for Singleton teachers. And if you want to study your curriculum, option 4 is for you. Let's find some virtual partners. What my team embraced was what you see on the screen as option 3. We would call that an interdisciplinary team studying academic or behavioral skills across classes. What do you need to do as a group? You need to figure out which option resonates the most with you, and you need to pursue it. The non-negotiable is every teacher needs to be involved in a meaningful collaborative team that is relentlessly questioning their practice and service of student learning. If you are improving your instruction and if you're helping more students learn important skills and dispositions, that counts. But you have to find a meaningful collaborative opportunity for everyone. All right, if you have any individual questions, be sure that you reach out. I'll leave my email in the session description at the bottom of the video as well. I hope this was helpful somehow. I just want you to sort of think through what's possible when it comes to collaboration for Singleton teachers. I'm passionate about it because I was a Singleton teacher for a long while. I'm also passionate about it because collaboration changed my practice. It made me a stronger teacher. Every teacher deserves to have that opportunity to be just as excited about collaborating with their peers. All right, speak to you soon.